Welcome back to the spring 2026 PCA breakdown over the 2026 spring UIL topic. So today we're going to focus on breaking down the human rights NEG case. The affirmative is probably going to look at more of like GDP growth and global, markets. On the negative side of this case, we're going to, kind of say, stop. Let's look at the individual. And this, case argues that a country's primary moral duty isn't to a global market, but to the basic rights and dignity of its own people. So let's start with the framework here. The value is justice, as the Pomerleau evidence. Oh, never mind. That's not the problem. I thought it was the Pomerleau evidence. This one's actually the Claren Velasquez. Velasquez 90 evidence that argues that justice is the core of all morality. Whenever there is a conflict of interest, like a global corporation wanting land and a local village needing water, we must appeal to justice to resolve it fairly, right? So let's start also on the criterion here, which kind of furthers this by promoting human rights. The criterion is promoting human rights, and rights are the minimum standards for dignity. But notice the specific philosophy we use from the Schroeder evidence here is rights as trumps. In the rights tradition, individuals are not just numbers to be balanced. We don't sacrifice the rights of a few workers to benefit the global economy. As Schroeder puts it, all rational persons must have a right not to be used without their consent, even for the benefit of others. So the utility of this is that this framework is a utilitarianism killer here. If the affirmative says globalization helps 90% of people get richer, you respond, that doesn't matter if you're violating the basic rights of the other 10%. Rights cannot be traded for money. So that kind of gets us into the contention itself as to why globalization is bad, developing nations, and protectionism is a better method for development, right? So we look first at globalization harming human rights. There are a couple of subpoints here that we're going to focus on, specifically corporate abuse, poverty, and brain drain. So let's start with corporate encroachment. So we look at multinational corporations. In developing countries like India, the drive for globalization has led to direct human rights violations. As the Samian 24 evidence points out, specific cases like the Placamata Coca-Cola plant and the Vendetta Alumina project, which aren't just economic stories, they're stories of corporate activities polluting water, taking land, violating the fundamental rights of local people in the name of global progress. Right, that's what this evidence specifically talks about. And then the Shufton evidence in '03 highlights a staggering economic hemorrhage of developing countries losing $500 billion annually under globalization. The human cost is extreme. Poverty becoming one, feminized, specifically poverty becoming an unequal attribution to minority populations, specifically women. 70% of all the poor developing nations in the world are women. In this case, argues that free trade has been free for industry, but expensive for women and for poor populations who are left behind as wealth concentrates to the top of these developing nations as opposed to the people of these developing nations, right? We get further into that when we talk about kind of brain drain. We look at education, as the shown evidence explains that when we prioritize global integration, skilled educators flee developing nations for higher salaries in the West, which leaves developing country school systems completely hollowed out. Furthermore, globalization standardizes the curricula by wiping out local knowledge and cultural diversity in favor of a one size fits all global education, which you could argue is detrimental to the national identity of populations. Then we get into kind of the solvency side of things. So we talked about how protectionism provides the solvency for a lot of these impacts. So I think the negative can solve by reclaiming sovereignty of individualized developing nations, right? So it starts with economic nationalism. The Ardwal and Minogue evidence explains that protectionism allows a country to be vocal for their local populations by safeguarding domestic industries. The government preserves local jobs and fosters pride rather than being a playground for foreign firms or foreign multinational corporations who want to come into these developing nations, buy up land, pollute water, buy up land from local villages, bulldoze villages in order to build, warehouses, factories, whatever they might need. Protectionism prevents those multinational corporations from being able to do that, and it protects the sovereignty of the localized populations of these developing nations. Second, national security. The father of free trade, Adam Smith, admitted that protectionism is necessary for the defense of the country, and that developing nations need to defend themselves before they can open themselves up to really just the teeth of a lot of these foreign multinational corporations that thrive on globalized economies that aren't ready for globalization yet. Prioritizing protectionism ensures that strategic sectors like food development and technological transfer can occur and stay under local control before they get taken over by multinational corporations. Third, we got to regulate the brain drain. The Tundle in 2022 evidence argues that a state has a negative duty to prevent brain drain by controlling borders and regulating the migration of skilled workers in critical fields like healthcare. Developing nation protect its own human capital and its citizens' right to health and education by prioritizing protections for those domestic industries in order for them to ensure that they are one retaining the best people in order to develop the innovative technologies necessary, but also retaining the best teachers in order to maintain education in their country. You don't want to be educating people to a high level in a country and then they just go and they work in the economy of another nation. No, you want them to stay in the developing countries so they can use their expertise to further the development of those industries, which is why introducing safeguards to those domestic industries through tariffs and other protectionist measures is necessary in order for that to occur, in order for that innovation and that experience to be able to garner and really root itself into a developing nation, which is essentially what the United States was doing throughout most of the 1800s. It was introducing extremely high tariff rates so that industries were forced to develop in the United States, were forced to prevent or provide the resilience and the local safety net for a lot of these globally or a lot of these economies and a lot of the populations in the United States by ensuring that there were always going to be factories open, always producing, because instead of importing tons of materials, the United States was able to manage its vast amount of resources effectively by prioritizing a protectionist economy before opening itself up to multinational corporations. So how can you win the human rights negative? Remember the three keys. First, focus on the victim here, right? The affirmative will talk about billions of dollars being protected through globalization. You need to talk about villagers who lost their water to a soda factory, the Palakmadov villagers who lost their water to a Coca-Cola factory, right? Make the impacts personal and specific. Second, the feminization argument of poverty, right? Use the 70% statistic. It's a powerful way to show that globalization isn't an equalizing force. It's a force that marginalizes the most vulnerable populations in developing nations. Third, rights as trumps, right? Use your framework to tell the judge that economic growth is a poor excuse for a human rights violation. If the affirmative can't guarantee that globalization won't exploit people, they lose the round under the justice value. So globalization, it promises a world without borders, but for many in the developing world, those borders are the only thing that's protecting their rights now, which is why a lot of developing nations need to prioritize the protectionist aspect of economic development. So in the next video, we will get into the consequentialism neg, and then finally the autonomy neg to round out these videos.